Welcome back everybody to the next video where we're going to explore the WARPAINTS FANATIC range. Now in this video we're going to really dig down into how these paints perform in an airbrush. I think there's been a lot of focus particularly on the brushwork with these paints, obviously because they're not specifically airbrush paints, but a lot of you are going to be wondering, you know, can they go through an airbrush? How can I use them through an airbrush? If there's a paint that you like but you want to go, well, I don't want to paint all my tanks by hand, for example, you're going to want to see if we can push them through the airbrush, and this video is going to show you that. The WARPAINTS FANATIC range, of course, is the new acrylic range from the Army Painter, who have sent me an early review copy. These drop, I think, around March time. So keep an eye out. There'll be lots of people creating lots of videos about how they perform, so it's really important for you guys to stay kind of informed about as much as you can about these paints. But just as a headline, they were great. They were great through the airbrush. Really enjoyed them. Great coverage. And what you're going to see me do throughout this video is basically airbrush 6 Horus Heresy miniatures, going from a matte Alpha Legion scheme to a Imperial Fist scheme to a Night Lord scheme. And then you'll see which colors I'm using, and then you'll see me kind of using them on in an airbrush, kind of on the miniature, and then I'm just going to talk about kind of my experience of using them. So this was in fact the first time that I had airbrushed these paints before. As I said on a previous video, I've used the WARPAINTS FANATIC set in 2023, or at least some of the paints within the FANATIC set in 2023, as I was part of the team that was kind of fed back to the Army Painter about them, but I had not had the opportunity to kind of use the flexible triad, and this was literally the first time that I've used it, so I was getting used to the paints as well. Now, in terms of airbrush thinner, so you cannot put these paints straight through the airbrush. They will be super spattery. It's just, you're not going to be able to do it. It will be the same as trying to put like a Games Workshop paint straight through your airbrush. It's just simply not going to work. So you've got to use a little bit of thinner. Now, right at the start of this video, you saw me show you some Army Painter thinner. I always tend to use Army Painter thinner now because they add a little bit of flow improver in, which I find really helps kind of the speckliness and the spatteriness of the paint, and it helps me avoid that. In terms of the ratio, I use 2 drops of thinner to 1 part paint with a PSI of around 25 to 30. Okay. You and your compressor will know each other well. You and your airbrush will know each other well. That's just what I use. I use an Iwata custom micron and a Sparmax compressor. You guys will have different kind of machinery and tools at home that you will want to use. So, kind of the big headlines on these. So what I noticed first about these paints as I was using them was that I was doing it straight over a black primer, but the paints were vivid despite that. So one trick that you can use to really kind of bump up the vibrancy of paints and to create contrast as well is to do a pre-highlight of white and then put your color over the top. What I found with these paints was that it was totally unnecessary to do that. Even your base layers were really vibrant with 1 or 2 thin coats through the airbrush, which is quite novel and different from my experience. Where I've used, say, Vallejo paints before, Vallejo paints would not be able to do that. Where I've used Games Workshop paints before, you know, so I'm using Lupercal Green for example, it would take a lot of layers to be able to kind of get a decent coat, you know, 3, 4, 5 layers. These were not like that at all. 1 or 2 thin coats, I was there. It was the color that I wanted, which was super, you know, which is absolutely brilliant. And also in terms of time saving, it means you're missing a step. So you can see here on this Emperor's Children Marine, you know, it's a pink, it's a magenta, and look how, you know, it's going over a black undercoat, and look how vibrant that color is, despite the fact it's just going over, you know, over black. It's really cool, something quite special, I think. In terms of, you know, the smoothness, they are very smooth. But again, that comes down to you understanding your airbrush and how much kind of thinner that you will need to use, what pressure on your compressor that you will need to use as well. So that's kind of is always going to be something personal. But if you get it right, these will go down smoothly. And as you can see with all these miniatures, and all these Space Marine kind of legions, they went down really, really smoothly. Okay. The other thing I would say, and this is something that I learned quite quickly, but definitely differed from paint to paint, was that in all cases, I used the flexible triad system, and I kind of referenced this right in my first video about these paints. I always say use 1, 2, 3. So in terms of the hues, I always use a flexible triad that went 1, 2, 3 or 3, 4, 5. It was always consecutive in terms of the way in which I selected the paints. What I didn't do was use, say, 1, 3 and then 6. Because the paints are really nice jumps up from one another. The tints are kind of, they're really, really nice as they go up. And there's nice gentle jumps. It meant that when you were applying it, there didn't feel like there was a big jump. So if you're somebody who absolutely loves contrast on their miniatures, you might want to consider using, say, 1, 3, 5 and missing a paint in between, because I found that actually you weren't able to tell too much that there was a jump between the last paint you were putting on and then the next paint you were putting on. That was always the case if I was, say, using 2 and 3. Alternatively, you could use just 1 or 3, for example. And here is a great example with this yellow. I'm putting on this paint, and there's just a slightly marginal kind of increase in brightness as I'm putting this paint down. So it gives nice subtle blends. But if you're looking for high contrast, you'll want to be able to that's something to factor in. So if you are looking for high contrast though, this is something you can do. You can use washes through the airbrush. Now these washes are just straight through the airbrush. They're unthinned, but hitting your model in the shadows on the side of the model in particular, kind of within the legs, underneath as well, helps to create some additional contrast. Now I absolutely love kind of contrast on my Space Marines. If you've seen any of my work on Instagram or Facebook, you'll know that I absolutely love it, just because it makes it pop on the tabletop and makes it pop in photos as well. But you can see here I'm using a purple for this Sons of Horus miniature. Now purple always is a great colour to shade for teal. With the Imperial Fist. Now, I didn't mention this, but with the Imperial Fist, I did use a white primer. I always tend to use a white primer when using yellow rather than black, because it just makes it go a really nasty kind of green colour, which isn't what we want at all. So that's a top tip for you. Use a white primer when doing Imperial Fist rather than black. Now this rust wash was really nice, created a really nice shadow for the Imperial Fist. And I've got a lot of experience with Imperial Fist, but I thought this was a really nice, kind of relatively straightforward recipe if you're looking to create a scheme for the 7th Legion. And then we have got with the Alpha Legion, we're using a dark blue tone, and then again exactly the same as we did previously, just straight through the airbrush. Now what I would say about these is that you've got to build them up in thin layers. Each of these miniatures were hit with 2 thin layers of this wash. And then, once you've done a bit, leave it or hair dry it and then come back to it. But it's really important that you leave it, let it dry, and then come back to it. It can take a few seconds, and you can even put air through the airbrush rather than paint, and that will help it dry as well. But again, it just adds that contrast. When you're considering the kind of each of the steps in terms of the paints and the brightness, they're quite subtle. Adding contrast this way is a good and clever way to do that. So my overall experience with these paints were really, really positive. And this is just, and these are the finished models that you can see. I think the one big takeaway that I would have was the vibrancy of the colors through the airbrush. Not having to put a white undercoat down or a white pre-highlight, with the exception of course of the Imperial Fist. Not having to put a white pre-highlight down and still having Marines that just absolutely popped, and you saw them right at the start and you can see them now, was something that I found particularly unique to this paint brand. So they've done an absolutely great job with the Fanatic range in terms of the vibrancy just over a black primer. Really, really impressed. Anyway, we will come back with another review video looking at another aspect of the WARPAINTS Fanatic range. I hope you've enjoyed this video, guys. Make sure you leave a comment and make sure you subscribe as well if this is your first time. Take care, guys, and see you soon.